He bragged about upgrading, until his ex arrived dripping in billionaire fashion. The gilded cage. The divorce had been final for exactly 13 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Not that Vivian Winters was counting. She stood behind the mahogany counter of Pemberton's rare books, carefully cataloging a shipment of Victorian poetry volumes, her fingers moving with the same precision she once used to handle priceless artifacts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That was before she became Mrs. Marcus Thornton. Before she spent 14 years as the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties for his venture capital associates, memorizing the names of their children and their wine preferences. The bell above the door chimed, pulling her from her methodical work. Greenwich Village's afternoon foot traffic rarely ventured into the dusty sanctuary of first editions and forgotten manuscripts. She preferred it that way. Here, among the weathered spines and foxed pages, she could pretend the last decade and a half had been merely a lengthy intermission, not a complete rewrite of her life's narrative. Her phone vibrated against the counter. Marcus. After a year of blessed silence, his name on her screen felt like discovering a spider in her coffee cup. Vivian, his voice oozed through the speaker, still carrying that particular blend of condescension and charm that had once made her feel chosen, rather than collected. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. She glanced around the empty bookstore. What do you want, Marcus? Always so direct. I've always admired that about you. The lie slithered through the phone. He'd spent years trying to sand down her edges, to transform her from a woman with opinions into an elegant accessory. I'm calling as a courtesy. You might receive an invitation to the annual Philanthropists' Ball. The committee still has your name from when you served on the acquisition board years ago. The Philanthropists' Ball, the crown jewel of Manhattan's social calendar, where 7-figure donations were as common as champagne toasts. She had helped organize it for 3 years, back when she still believed she was building something meaningful alongside Marcus. And, she prompted, knowing there was more. With Marcus there always was. Well, Sienna and I will be attending naturally. She's being honored for her charitable work with sustainable fashion influencers. He paused, letting the word sustainable fashion influencers hang in the air like a particularly pretentious art installation. It's quite a sophisticated affair now. The committee has really elevated the guest list. More refined, you might say. International tastemakers, that sort of thing. Vivian's free hand clenched, around a leather-bound Keats. How thoughtful of you to warn me. I just wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed. Sienna moves in rather exclusive circles. She has this natural sophistication, you understand. It's breeding, really. The kind of polish that comes from growing up in that world. Breeding, as if his new fiancée were a show dog rather than a 28-year-old, whose greatest achievement was convincing 2 million followers that her sponsored content was authentic self-expression. She speaks 4 languages fluently, Marcus continued, apparently mistaking Vivian's silence for interest. Did her master's at the Sorbonne. In influencer marketing, but still, the Sorbonne is the Sorbonne. Vivian had spoken 3 languages fluently before she let them rust in favor of perfecting Marcus's preferred dinner party conversation topics: market volatility, yacht specifications, and the comparative merits of various private schools she would never send children to, because Marcus had decided children would interfere with his lifestyle. I appreciate the heads up, Vivian managed, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. I'll be sure to send my regrets. Probably for the best. You know how vicious that crowd can be if you don't quite fit anymore. And Vivian? His voice dropped to what he probably thought was kindness but was actually pity. You're better off focusing on your little bookshop job. Some people are meant for quieter lives. The line went dead. Vivian stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the silence that somehow felt louder than Marcus's words. Around her, thousands of books held their breath. Their authors' dreams and ambitions pressed between pages that would outlast any party, any marriage, any man who confused cruelty with sophistication. She set the phone down with excessive care and returned to her cataloging. But her hands shook as she opened the next volume, a first edition of Emily Dickinson, the poet who had chosen her own version of a quiet life, who had written verses that would outlive every glittering socialite of her era. Nobody. Who are you? Vivian whispered to the empty store, quoting the poem from memory. Are you nobody too? The afternoon dissolved into evening, customers coming and going in a blur. Vivian moved through her duties automatically, her mind elsewhere, replaying Marcus's words until they lost their sting and gained an edge. She had been somebody once. Before Marcus, she had been Vivian Winters, the youngest curator ever appointed to the Met's European Sculpture and Decorative Arts Department. She had published papers on Renaissance restoration techniques. She had been invited to speak at conferences in Florence and Vienna. She locked up the bookstore at 7, stepping out into the village's Friday night energy. The streets thrummed with possibility, with people pursuing their ambitions or their pleasures or both. She walked to her studio apartment, a far cry from the Upper East Side penthouse she'd once called home. The walls were lined with her own sketches and architectural drawings, plans for museum wings that would never be built, restoration proposals for buildings that would crumble without her expertise. On her small drafting table sat her latest project, something she worked on late at night when sleep eluded her. It was a proposal for converting abandoned Gilded Age mansions into hybrid spaces, part museum, part cultural center, part affordable artist housing. She called it Living History, and it was brilliant, revolutionary even. But it was also just paper and pencil, dreams without backing, vision without venue. The invitation arrived the next morning, slipped under her door while she slept. Cream-colored cardstock so thick it could have been carved rather than printed, with gold embossing that caught the light like trapped sunshine. The philanthropist's ball cordially requested her presence. Black tie required, donations encouraged but not mandatory for alumni committee members. She should have thrown it away. Should have torn it into confetti and let it snow down onto the street. Instead, she propped it against her bathroom mirror, where it watched her brush her teeth, apply her drugstore moisturizer, pull her hair into the same practical bun she'd worn for the past year. Some people are meant for quieter lives, Marcus had said. Vivian stared at her reflection, at the woman she'd let herself become. 42 years old, divorced, working retail, living in a studio apartment with spectacular dreams and no way to build them. She looked tired. She looked defeated. She looked exactly like the woman Marcus expected to see if she dared show up at that ball. The fury that had simmered since his phone call suddenly crystallized into something harder, sharper, termination perhaps, or maybe just spite elevated to an art form. She would go to that ball. She didn't know how she would afford an appropriate dress or how she would walk into that room full of people who had already heard Marcus's version of their story. But she would go, because some people were meant for quieter lives. But Vivian Winters wasn't some people, not anymore. The transformation. The collision happened on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the ball. Vivian was balancing a tower of rare manuscripts, navigating the narrow aisle between philosophy and poetry, when she crashed directly into what felt like a wall of expensive wool. The manuscripts flew everywhere. A particularly valuable illuminated medieval text landed face down in a puddle of rainwater that had dripped from someone's umbrella. Vivian dropped to her knees, frantically gathering the scattered books, her apologies tumbling out in a mortified rush. "That's a 15th century book of hours," a deep voice observed from above her. "Worth approximately $300,000, though I suspect water damage might affect that valuation." Vivian looked up, ready to defend herself, and froze. The man standing over her wasn't just wealthy. Wealth radiated from him like heat from a forge. Salt and pepper hair swept back from a face that belonged on a Roman coin, sharp and imperious. His suit probably cost more than her annual salary, and his shoes. She didn't even want to think about the shoes. "Adrian Blackwood," he said, extending a hand to help her up. She knew the name. Everyone in New York knew the name. Real estate mogul, art collector, philanthropist, and notorious recluse who appeared in public exactly 3 times a year. His foundation had donated entire wings to museums. Marcus had spent 2 years trying to get a meeting with him, desperate to manage even a fraction of the Blackwood portfolio. "I'm so sorry about the manuscripts," Vivian said, accepting his hand. His grip was firm, calloused in unexpected places. "The Book of Hours is actually a reproduction. 19th century, not 15th. Still valuable, but not irreplaceable. The illumination style is wrong for medieval work. See the gold leaf? Too uniform. Medieval monks had steadier hands but less consistent materials." His eyebrows rose slightly. "You know your manuscripts. I know my forgeries. The genuine ones are in the vault. She carefully dried the reproduction with her cardigan. Though this is still worth about $30,000, Mr. Pemberton would have my head if I'd actually damaged it. You're not Pemberton's usual clerk. It wasn't a question. Vivian straightened, still clutching the damp books. I'm exactly Pemberton's usual clerk. I catalog, I sell, I lock up. And you can spot a 19th century reproduction at a glance. He studied her with unsettling intensity. What did you do before you became exactly a usual clerk? I lived a different life. She turned to reshelf the manuscripts, hoping he would take the hint and leave. He didn't. Instead, he pulled out a slim leather notebook and began sketching something. I'm looking for a first edition Burton. The Anatomy of Melancholy. Does Pemberton have one? 1621? We have a 1638 third edition. First editions are practically mythical. She paused. Though there's an estate sale next week in Connecticut. The Fairweather collection. They might have one, but the authentication would be complex. Burton made changes between printings that most people miss. Show me. For the next hour, Vivian walked him through the labyrinthine process of authenticating early printed books. He asked intelligent questions, took precise notes, and revealed a depth of knowledge that surprised her. When she pulled out her own notebook to show him a comparison chart she'd been developing for tracking print variations, something shifted in his expression. This is your handwriting? He was looking at the margins where she'd sketched architectural details, cornices and capitals from the buildings she passed on her walks, restored in her imagination to their original grandeur. I sketch sometimes. It helps me think. These are restoration plans, it wasn't a question. He turned the page, finding her detailed drawings of the Crown Building's terracotta facade. You're proposing to restore the original polychrome? It's just theoretical. A hobby. No, he said slowly. It's not. He studied her with that penetrating gaze. You're the V. Winters who wrote that paper on adaptive reuse of Beaux-Arts architecture. The one that suggested converting the abandoned Millionaire's Row mansions into cultural centers. Vivian's breath caught. That was published 12 years ago, in an obscure academic journal. I read everything about architecture in this city, obscure or otherwise. He closed her notebook carefully, handing it back. I've been looking for someone with your specific expertise. I've acquired the Cornelius Vanderbilt II house. Vivian nearly dropped the notebook. The Vanderbilt mansion was the crown jewel of lost New York architecture, a Fifth Avenue palace that had been partially demolished in 1927. Only the gatehouse remained, but there were rumors that Blackwood had somehow acquired rights to rebuild. You can't be serious. I'm always serious about architecture. I want to rebuild it, but not as a museum, as something living. Your paper suggested a model, historical authenticity with modern functionality. I want you to lead the project. I work in a bookstore. You're wasting your talent in a bookstore. He pulled out a business card, heavy black stock with silver embossing. My office Thursday 2 p.m. We'll discuss terms. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate the offer, but... Adrian, he was already moving toward the door. And bring your notebooks, all of them. He left before she could refuse again, the bell chiming his departure like punctuation. Vivian stood in the empty store, holding his card, her mind racing. The Vanderbilt project was the kind of opportunity that came along once in a lifetime. The kind of project that could resurrect a career, a reputation, a life. Thursday arrived despite her conviction that she wouldn't go. She dressed in her best outfit, a 5-year-old Max Mara suit that had survived the divorce, though it hung looser now. The Blackwood Holdings building was a glass spear piercing the sky, all angular modernism and reflected light. His office occupied the entire top floor. The elevator opened directly into a space that was part workspace, part art gallery, part architectural library. Models of buildings covered every surface. Some built, some imagined, all extraordinary. You came, Adrian said from behind a desk that looked carved from a single piece of obsidian. I came to explain why I can't accept your offer. Sit. It wasn't quite an order, but it wasn't exactly a request either. Tell me why you can't accept an offer you haven't heard. I haven't worked in the field for over a decade. I don't have a team, connections, recent references. You have vision. The rest is just logistics. He pushed a folder across the desk. The terms. The salary is negotiable upward, not down. Vivian opened the folder and forgot how to breathe. The number had too many zeros. It was more than Marcus made in a good year. This is insane. This is market rate for someone who can do what you can do. He leaned back, studying her. Someone talked you out of your worth. Husband? The accuracy of the guess must have shown on her face. It's always husbands, he said with dry disdain. They marry brilliance, then spend years trying to dim it. Makes them feel taller. He stood, moving to the window wall that showcased Manhattan spread below like a circuit board. I was married once. She thought my ambitions were too large, said I should be content with moderate success. We divorced and I built this. He gestured to the city. She married a dentist. Despite herself, Vivian laughed. There's one condition, he said, turning back to her. The philanthropist's ball. You'll attend as my companion. Excuse me? I need someone who understands architecture to discuss the project with potential investors. Swiss bankers find me tedious, but they might listen to you. That's in 3 weeks. Stella will handle your preparation. As if summoned, a woman appeared in the doorway, mid-60s, wearing Chanel with the casual elegance of someone born to it. Stella Hartwell, she introduced herself. I manage Adrian's social obligations, which thankfully are few. You must be Vivian. We have work to do. I haven't agreed to anything, Vivian protested. Yes, Adrian said simply. You have. You agreed the moment you walked in here. Because you're tired of letting someone else's narrative define you. The ball is your reintroduction to the world. After that, we rebuild the Vanderbilt. Then we rebuild whatever else catches our interest. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur. Days were spent in Adrian's office, poring over architectural plans, historical documents, and budget projections. Evenings belonged to Stella, who approached Vivian's transformation with military precision. Posture first, Stella declared during their first session. You're apologizing with your shoulders. Stop it. There were sessions on current events, art market trends, and the subtle politics of philanthropic circles. Stella corrected Vivian's pronunciation of designers' names, updated her on who had divorced whom, and provided detailed dossiers on every major player who would attend the ball. Marcus Thornton, Stella read from her notes with obvious distaste, new money pretending to be old. Engaged to a child who thinks influence is the same as importance. They'll be seated at table 12. You'll be at table 1. Table 1? With Adrian. The Swiss bankers. And hopefully, by the end of the night, 3 new investors in your Vanderbilt project. The shopping happened in stages. First, the understated pieces, day dresses and suits for the office, each one perfectly tailored. Then the statement pieces for smaller events. Finally, the gown for the ball itself. They were in Bergdorf's private salon when Vivian saw it. Valentino haute couture, black silk that seemed to absorb light, with a bodice hand-embroidered with thousands of tiny crystals that created the effect of constellations. Try it on, Stella commanded. The dress fit as if it had been sewn onto her body. It was architectural in its construction, each seam and dart creating structure that was both classical and utterly modern. How much? Vivian whispered. Irrelevant, Stella replied. Adrian's investment in you has already yielded a $12 million commitment from the Preservation Society. You've more than earned it. This isn't me, Vivian said, staring at her reflection. No, Stella agreed. This is who you always were underneath the compromise. The reckoning. The night of the philanthropist's ball arrived wrapped in unseasonable warmth, as if October had forgotten its assignment and delivered May instead. Vivian stood before the full-length mirror in her apartment, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. The Valentino gown transformed her into something mythical, not younger but timeless. The constellation of crystals caught every shift of light, creating the illusion that she was dressed in the night sky itself. Stella had overseen every detail. Hair swept into an architectural chignon that echoed the classical lines of the buildings Vivian loved. Makeup that enhanced rather than masked. Charlotte Tilbury's team had been brought in specifically. The shoes were Louboutin, custom-made to ensure she could stand all evening without wincing. But the masterpiece was the jewelry. A single strand of black Tahitian pearls from Adrian's private collection, each one worth more than her father had made in his lifetime. They belonged to Eleanor Roosevelt, Adrian had said when he presented them. She wore them to state dinners where she changed American history. Seemed appropriate. The car he sent wasn't a limousine. Too obvious, Stella had declared. Instead, it was a vintage Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, the kind of vehicle that whispered rather than shouted its worth. The driver, an elderly man named Harrison, had apparently been driving for the Blackwood family for 40 years. "Mr. Blackwood is already at the venue," Harrison informed her as they glided through Manhattan traffic. "He asked me to tell you that the Swiss are eager to meet you. Apparently, your preliminary proposal has caused quite a stir." The Metropolitan Club rose before them like a Florentine palace transported to Fifth Avenue. Photographers lined the steps, their cameras creating a constellation of flashes that rivaled the stars hidden by the city's glow. Vivian had walked these steps dozens of times during her marriage, but always in Marcus's shadow, always as an accessory. Tonight, she walked alone. The first person she encountered in the marble lobby was Patricia Ashford, one of Marcus's business partner's wives. Patricia, who had stopped returning Vivian's calls the day the divorce was announced. "Vivian," Patricia's voice rose an entire octave. "Is that you? But how? I mean, you look—" She trailed off, apparently unable to reconcile the woman before her with the discarded wife she'd gossiped about for months. "Patricia," Vivian said smoothly, channeling Stella's lessons. "How lovely to see you. You must excuse me. I'm expected at the reception." She swept past, leaving Patricia gaping like a landed fish. The ballroom doors opened onto a scene from a Fitzgerald novel. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over hundreds of guests, each one a player in New York's elaborate social chess game. The air hummed with conversations in multiple languages, deals being struck over champagne, alliances forming and dissolving with each air kiss. Adrian materialized at her elbow as if he'd been waiting. He was devastating in perfectly tailored black tie, the kind of man who made formal wear look comfortable. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," she admitted. "Good. Confidence is just fear that's learned to walk in heels." He offered his arm. "Come." The Swiss are dying to discuss load-bearing calculations for historical facades. The Swiss bankers turned out to be three brothers who controlled a significant portion of Europe's private wealth. They peppered Vivian with questions about structural engineering, historical preservation, and the economics of adaptive reuse. She found herself in her element, discussing compression ratings and cantilever systems with the same ease she'd once discussed kindergarten admissions at Marcus's dinner parties. "Brilliant," one of the brothers declared after she explained her solution for integrating modern climate control into 19th century architectural shells. "We're in. 20 million to start." Adrian smiled. A real smile, not his usual sardonic twist of lips. "I told you she was extraordinary." That's when Vivian saw them. Marcus entered the ballroom with Sienna on his arm, and for a moment, time stuttered. He looked exactly the same, sandy hair perfectly styled, that particular swagger that confused arrogance with confidence. But Sienna was the real shock. In person, she looked even younger than her 28 years. Dressed in what was obviously designer but somehow looked like she was playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. They hadn't seen her yet. They were too busy posing for photographers, Sienna arranging herself in practiced angles while Marcus basked in the reflected glory of her Instagram following. "Breathe," Adrian murmured beside her. "You're worth 10 of him and 1,000 of her. You don't know him. I know enough. He tried to get a meeting with me 16 times. I had my assistant tell him I don't waste time with men who confuse acquisition with accomplishment." Before Vivian could respond, the evening's host called for attention. The awards portion of the evening was beginning. Various philanthropists were recognized for their contributions, a hospital wing here, a scholarship fund there. Then came Sienna's moment. For her innovative work bringing sustainable fashion to social media, the host announced, as Sienna glided to the stage in what was definitely not sustainable fashion. Her acceptance speech was a masterclass in saying nothing with great enthusiasm. She thanked her followers, her engagement rate, and 3 different brands who had sponsored her charitable posts. Marcus watched with the pride of a man who'd trained a particularly clever parrot. And finally, the host continued as Sienna descended, "We have a special announcement. The Blackwood Foundation, in partnership with the Vanderbilt Restoration Project, will be committing $50 million to preserve and reimagine New York's architectural heritage. Leading this project is Vivian Winters, whose groundbreaking work in adaptive historical preservation has redefined how we think about our city's past and future." The spotlight found her before she could run. "Adrian," was gently pushing her toward the stage. The room erupted in applause, but all Vivian could see was Marcus's face. The progression from confusion to recognition to absolute shock was almost comedic. She climbed the steps on legs that somehow remained steady. The microphone waited like a challenge. "Architecture," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "is autobiography written in stone and steel. The buildings we save tell the story of who we were. The buildings we create tell the story of who we're becoming. This project isn't just about preserving the past. It's about proving that beauty and history can coexist with progress and purpose." She spoke for 3 minutes about the Vanderbilt project, about creating spaces that honored history while serving contemporary needs. The crowd was riveted. These were people who collected art and endowed museums, who understood the value of preserving beauty. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She descended the stage to find Marcus waiting at the bottom. "Vivian," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of assumed authority, "we need to talk." "No," she said simply, "we don't." She tried to move past him, but he caught her arm. "Is this some kind of joke? You're working with Blackwood? Do you have any idea what people are saying? I imagine they're saying I've landed the architectural commission of the decade." She removed his hand from her arm with deliberate calm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have investors to speak with. This is about us, isn't it?" His voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "You're trying to prove something. I get it, the divorce was hard. The divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me." The words came out clear and true. "You did me a favor, Marcus. You freed me to become who I was always meant to be." Sienna appeared at his shoulder, all wide eyes and territorial body language. "Babe, is everything okay?" "Everything's perfect," Vivian said, addressing Sienna for the first time. "You two deserve each other. Truly." She walked away, leaving them to decipher whether she'd just insulted them or not. The rest of the evening passed in a champagne-tinted blur. Everyone wanted to meet her, to hear about the project, to understand how she'd captured Adrian Blackwood's notoriously difficult-to-earn attention. She discussed Byzantine restoration techniques with a Russian oligarch, debated modernism versus classical revival with a French ambassador, and somehow ended up explaining load distribution in Gothic cathedrals to a fascinated tech billionaire. Through it all, Adrian remained nearby, not hovering but present, a steadying force in the social maelstrom. It was nearly midnight when she found herself on the terrace, the city spread below in its glittering grid. The October air had cooled, carrying hints of autumn despite the day's warmth. "You survived," Adrian said, joining her at the balustrade. "I did more than survive." "Yes," he agreed. "You did." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city pulse with its endless energy. "Why did you really help me?" Vivian asked finally. "And don't say it was for the project. You could have hired any architect in the world." Adrian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "My wife," he said finally, "told me I was incapable of real emotion, that I could only see the world in terms of transactions and acquisitions. After the divorce, I proved her right for a decade. Built an empire on being exactly as cold as she'd accused me of being." He turned to face her. "Then I read your paper. Not the academic one, though that was brilliant. The one you published right after your degree. About how buildings hold memories, how architecture is an act of hope. You wrote that every renovation is a bet on the future, a belief that something deserves to exist tomorrow." Vivian's breath caught. She'd forgotten that paper, written when she was 24 and believed anything was possible. "I've been renovating buildings ever since," Adrian continued, "but I think maybe I was waiting to renovate myself. You're not my project, Vivian. You're my proof that sometimes people deserve second chances at becoming who they were meant to be." The foundation. The photographer from the Times caught them at exactly the right moment. Vivian laughing at something Adrian whispered, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the city lights creating a backdrop that looked painted. When the photo ran 3 days later alongside a feature on the Vanderbilt project, the headline read, "The Architecture of Redemption, Vivian Winters Rebuilds New York's Past and Her Own Future." Marcus called 17 times that day. Vivian deleted each voicemail without listening. The real work began the following Monday. Adrian had assembled a team that read like an architectural fantasy, structural engineers from Tokyo, historical preservation specialists from Rome, sustainable design experts from Copenhagen. They gathered in the war room Adrian had created on the 40th floor of his building, where every surface was covered with blueprints, historical photographs, and material samples. The challenge, Vivian explained to the assembled team, isn't just rebuilding what was lost, it's creating something that honors the past while serving the present. The original mansion was built for a family of 5 with a staff of 70. We're creating mixed-use space, affordable artist studios, public galleries, and yes, luxury residences to fund the rest. Impossible, declared Henrik, the lead engineer from Berlin. The load-bearing requirements alone are complex but not impossible, Vivian interrupted, pulling out her calculations. If we use a hybrid steel frame concealed within historically accurate facades, we can support modern amenities while maintaining architectural integrity. She spent the next hour walking them through her vision, sketching solutions on the glass walls, answering every challenge with detailed responses she'd been developing in her mind for years. By the end, even skeptical Henrik was nodding. It's ambitious, he admitted. Perhaps too ambitious, but it could work. It will work, Adrian said from the doorway. He'd been watching the entire presentation, because Vivian doesn't accept impossible as an answer. The weeks that followed were a blur of 18-hour days and constant problem-solving. Vivian found herself remembering skills she'd buried during her marriage, not just the technical knowledge but the confidence to defend her ideas, to push back against skeptics, to lead. Stella appeared periodically, ensuring Vivian ate actual meals instead of surviving on coffee and architectural dreams. She also managed Vivian's emerging public profile with strategic precision. Architectural Digest wants a feature, she announced one afternoon. Vogue wants to photograph you in the construction site. The Met wants you to lecture on preservation techniques. I don't have time for it. You'll make time, Stella interrupted. This project needs public support. You're not just rebuilding a mansion. You're changing how New York thinks about its architectural heritage. That requires visibility. The Vogue shoot was surreal. They dressed her in Carolina Herrera, while she stood amid exposed beams and century-old brickwork. The contrast between elegance and construction creating images that would later win awards. You're natural at this, the photographer said. Most people freeze up. I spent 14 years pretending to be someone else, Vivian replied. This is the first time I'm just being myself. It was during the 3rd week of construction that Sienna appeared at the site. Vivian was reviewing foundation plans with the engineering team when security called up. There's a Miss Hayes here? Says she needs to speak with you urgently. Vivian considered refusing, then curiosity won. Send her up. Sienna arrived looking out of place in designer heels that sank into construction dust. Her usual Instagram-ready appearance somewhat wilted by the industrial elevator ride. We need to talk, she announced without preamble. About what? About Marcus. He's obsessed with you. With this, she gestured vaguely at the construction site. He watches that Times video every day. He's hired a PR firm to remake his image. He's even talking about getting into historical preservation. That's not my problem, isn't it? Sienna's voice cracked slightly. You won. Whatever you were trying to prove, you proved it. Can't you just leave us alone? Vivian set down her blueprints, really looking at the younger woman for the first time. Underneath the perfectly contoured makeup and carefully curated outfit was genuine distress. Sienna, she said gently, I'm not doing anything to you or to Marcus. I'm building a life that has nothing to do with either of you. If Marcus is obsessed with what I'm doing, that's about his ego, not my revenge. He says you were the one who got away. That he made a mistake. He's right. He did make a mistake. But not the one he thinks. Vivian pulled off her hard hat, running a hand through her hair. He thinks his mistake was leaving me. But his real mistake was making me small enough to leave. He spent years convincing me I was lucky to be his wife, that I should be grateful for the life he provided. It never occurred to him that I could provide my own life. Sienna stared at her, something shifting in her expression. He does that to me too. Makes little comments about my degree not being serious, about how I should be grateful he sees past my Instagram phase. Then maybe you should ask yourself why you're fighting to keep a man who makes you feel like you need to be grateful for his attention. It's not that simple. Our engagement announcement got 3 million likes. We have brand deals together. Brands can be rebuilt. Trust me, I know. Sienna left looking thoughtful. 2 weeks later, Page 6 reported that she'd ended the engagement and signed a deal for her own reality show about women entrepreneurs. Marcus's response was predictable. He showed up at the construction site himself, catching Vivian as she was leaving for the day. "Happy now?" he demanded. "You've destroyed my relationship. Your relationship destroyed itself. I just gave Sienna permission to notice. This isn't you, Vivian. This whole thing, Blackwood, the project, the attitude. You're playing a role." "No, Marcus. For 14 years I played a role. The grateful wife, the supportive partner, the woman who made herself smaller so you could feel bigger. This is who I actually am. I could have made you happy. You could have, but you were too busy making me convenient." She walked past him to the waiting car. Adrian insisted on a driver after the late nights became routine. Marcus called after her, but she didn't turn around. Some conversations were better left unfinished. That evening, she found Adrian in his office studying models of the completed project. The miniature buildings were perfect, down to the tiny gargoyles they were having carved in Italy. "Marcus visited the site," she said. "I know. Security called me. He didn't look up from the models. Do you want me to have him banned?" "No, he's harmless. Just desperate to matter again. Aren't we all?" Adrian picked up one of the tiny buildings, examining it with the same intensity he brought to everything. "The difference is some of us do something about it." "Is that why you're doing this? To matter?" He set down the model, finally meeting her eyes. "I'm doing this because beautiful things deserve to exist. Because you had a vision that deserved to be built. And because—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Because watching you remember who you are has been the most interesting thing I've seen in a decade." The air between them shifted, charged with possibility. "Adrian, I know," he said quietly. "Too soon. Too complicated. Too everything. But Vivian, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Building beautiful things with you is enough for now."